work on the assumption that morning is okay until 1 o'clock, so forgive me if it's an inaccuracy. Thank you very, very much for being with us. We're very grateful. I have to read out the kind of police warning, if that's all right, ahead of time. And then it's the caution. As you know, this session is open to the public. A webcast of the session goes out live and is subsequently accessible via the parliamentary website. A verbatim transcript will be taken of your evidence and put on the parliamentary website. You'll have an opportunity to make minor corrections for the purposes of clarification or accuracy. For the record, would you introduce yourselves? And then, Mr. Cerf, I think you want to make a short introductory statement.
Yes, I appreciate that very much, Your Lord. Lordship. I'll never get this right. I'm an American. I watch too much Downton Abbey. My name is Vint Cerf. I am Vice President and Chief Internet Evangelist at Google. And I think that you will appreciate that I did not ask for this title. The last time I met in a committee of the House of Lords, I was asked what title did I ask for, and my answer was Archduke. However, they didn't find any way to assign that title in the HR system, and so I am your Chief Internet Evangelist.
If it makes you feel better, no one around this table asked their titles either.
So the other thing I wanted to say is thank you so much, first of all, for accommodating my hearing impairment. This seems to be working beautifully. I'm very relieved. And second, I wanted to thank you for actually doing this. As an American, I have a kind of an uncertain understanding of the processes in Parliament, but I've been given to understand that laws that are passed in the House of Commons come to the House of Lords for improvement. And the process requires due diligence. And it's my impression that this is what this meeting is about. It is due diligence on the topic. So I am really grateful and impressed by your determination to learn more. And I hope that my colleague and I will be able to help. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Incidentally, it's not just legislation that comes to the House of Lords for improvement, it's also people, which is particularly parliamentarians. Could I start? Lord Harris will have the first question. Just before I do, it's a sort of slightly personal remark, but it's I'm one of a number of people who are somewhat in awe of you. I mean, you are an extraordinarily influential figure in the history of the digital world. And we've connected through MIT, and I am a huge fan. The point I want to make is this. The other day, we took, in a different situation, we took evidence from David Attenborough.
Yes.
And I see you, I'm not being embarrassing, I see you very much as being the David Attenborough of the digital world. That's
my.
Well, I'm sorry, yes, I'm saying no pressure. But I think there are people who look to you in exactly the way that people look to David as signifying truth. It's very important. Now, with that comes obviously huge responsibility. And all I wanted to suggest was, when you say something is the way it is, there is no one I know in the digital world who's going to question that. And as I say, that is a huge responsibility, and it's one of the reasons we were desperately keen to meet with you and hear from you, because we have heard people who quite clearly have got their own, sometimes quite prejudiced version of where we've got to and where we're going. And so we'll say, with that, and with no pressure whatsoever attached to it, Toby Harris, the first question.
Thank you very much. And my apologies for missing the first part of your explanation as to your title of Archduke, sir. Look, your written evidence states that you use, or Google uses, algorithms to evaluate, quotes, high-quality information as determined by user testing rather than subjective determination about the truthfulness of particular websites. Do you think there is any version of objective truth?
That's a really good question. And as a scientist, I have to tell you that at the very best, we only have an approximation to truth or approximation to the way the real world works. I'm sure that you've had the experience of being told that the way things work is X. And 10 years later, you get the advice that, well, we've studied the problem and now we've discovered that it really is Y and Y is not X. Scientists, if they are honest, have to be prepared to give up their theories if evidence shows that the theory isn't correct. So we're not so much looking for absolute truth, since I'm not sure that we can attain that, but we can look for good quality. We can look for good sources. And so the algorithms that we use try to find what we believe to be good quality content, whether it's in the Google search system or in the YouTube videos, to offer good quality information. The recipients of that information have the challenge of figuring out what to accept and what to reject. We don't try to tell them that. We try to give them the best quality information that we can.
But there are some things which I think, even as a recovering scientist, and you as a scientist might say, are still pretty true. For example, there are very few adherents of the view that the Earth is flat. But there may be. I'm certainly not one of them. So, can you give us any evidence that this high-quality information, as you describe it, and that you promote, is more likely to be true, more likely to be in the category of the Earth is not flat, rather than the category of the Earth is flat? Because people can say the Earth is flat with great authority and even produce all sorts of material which they cite as evidence.
So let me suggest two things. I think Katie, my colleague, and I should respond to this. I'd like to respond on the search side of things, and Katie, perhaps you could respond on the YouTube side of things. Those are two different sources of information that come to our users. On the search side, first of all, let me draw your attention to a book that we would be happy to make available to you if you would like, called How Search Works. And it's a useful high-level reference of the mechanics of the search system, including the mechanisms by which we try to determine good quality of the contents of the World Wide Web. I'm sure every single one of you who has experienced searching through the World Wide Web, either with our search engines or others, have discovered that there is a vast and dynamic range of quality. And so you're confronted with trying to sort through what's useful and what isn't. The amount of information in the World Wide Web is extraordinarily large, huge numbers of pages, billions of them. So we have no ability to manually go through all of that content and evaluate it. But we do have about 10,000 people, who is part of our Google family, that do evaluations of websites. We have perhaps as many as 9 opinions of selected pages. We have a 168-page document, which is, in the case of search, is given over to how you determine quality of a website. So imagine for a moment that these people are going through web pages, evaluating them according to criteria that are found here. This, by the way, is publicly available. People who make web pages have access to this as well. And so they have guidance as to how to construct a website that we would consider to be of good quality. Once we have samples of web pages that have been evaluated by those evaluators, we can then take what they have done and the web pages that their evaluations have applied to, and we make a machine learning neural network which reflects the quality that they have been able to assert for the web pages. So those web pages become the training set for a machine learning system. The machine learning system is then applied to all of the web pages that we index in the World Wide Web. And once that application has been done, we use that information and other indicators to rank order the responses that come back from a web search. So there's a two-step process. There's the manual process to establish criteria and good quality training set, and then a machine learning system in order to scale up to the size of the World Wide Web that we index. So that's how we try to do that for the search system, and maybe Katie could say a little bit about how we do it for YouTube, which is different.
Hello everyone, I'm Katie O'Donovan. I work at Google with Vint, but based in the UK, and I head up our Government Affairs and Public Policy team, and very happy to be here today to have looked at the committee's work so far. And I think, as Vint just described on search, that means for a query around Flat Earth, actually we're able to give a very clear summary of information on a search page that indicates the reflection of scientific consensus over the shape of the Earth. And on YouTube, we also have a similar challenge. So YouTube is our video hosting platform, where around you have about 400 hours worth of content uploaded every single minute on the platform. And that will cover everything from DIY videos through to music and entertainment videos, through to House of Lords Select Committee content and theories about different scientific questions. And I think this captured this challenge very well by a previous person who gave evidence as the chair of the CDEI, who said there's a difference between freedom of speech and freedom of reach. And I think on YouTube we look very carefully at how we make sure that while we may host the information, it is hosted within the right framework for users and viewers to understand the consequence of that. So to begin with, we have very firm community guidelines on what is and isn't allowed on YouTube, and that would include things that you wouldn't expect to be allowed, so content which incites hate or incites violence, or other areas that, even though they might not be illegal, most people would agree there is no need for that content to be on YouTube. And we've made significant shifts in our policies over the last 3 years, introducing more and more policies to define what is and isn't allowed. And then you would reach content that perhaps, like the Flat Earth scenario, isn't illegal. So if you wander into a bookshop or even a library, you may find content supporting those theories on there. But we want our users to make sure that they understand that actually this is one opinion that's out there, and it may not be the consensus, the mainstream, or the scientifically preferred view. And this is where we work to raise up content which is authoritative. So if somebody has hosted a video on YouTube, we make sure that there's an information panel which relates to what the agreed scientific consensus is, and that will direct you to a third-party source. So you might see a piece of content up there, but you'll understand that actually different scientific organisations with weight and experience and expertise don't agree with that view. We'll also make sure that if you are searching for this content, it isn't necessarily returned. So what we want to do is make sure that we're raising up more authoritative content. So if you're looking for a question around what shape is the Earth, instead of us pointing you to a video which has been uploaded, which has very limited number of views and which we know doesn't reflect the scientific consensus, again we work with external experts to help us and to help our machine learning tools determine actually what is an authoritative response, and make sure that that is prominent and easy to find on the platform. And we make sure that we reward content which meets those trusted and informative criteria, and actually the incentives for producing more controversial content isn't there. And then we make sure that not everyone has the opportunity to monetize on YouTube, which again impacts the likelihood that that content will be created.
So I wonder if I could ask Katie a question. Am I allowed to ask questions? This doesn't always, in Senate
a more
hearings,
informed question.
in Senate hearings, it's not always the case. So, Katie, you mentioned information panels, and it's my understanding that those are curated in a manual way. And so, for controversial content, we go to the trouble of making sure that if we can tell that it's controversial, that we go to the trouble of pulling up those information panels and making them available. But that's something that we curate as opposed to doing automatically. Am I correct about that?
So I think we would look at what content is needed, which category of videos and content needs those information panels, yes.
Lord Harris and then Lord Lipsey.
I have to say I'm slightly, I understand what you're saying. I'm just thinking of my experience, and it seems to me that if I Google anything about 9/11, I get far more conspiracy theories about why it didn't really happen, or it was a false flag exercise or something like that. So I'm not quite sure how this kicks in. Admittedly I didn't check that last night, but that is the experience. So really the fundamental question is, why should anyone really believe that your algorithm does successfully identify a trusted source of information. And I'm bearing in mind your evidence, which told us that if you give too much detail in public about our processes, that provides opportunities for malicious actors to try and play the system.
I think that the last point, I think, is correct, that if you try to lay out in detail how the algorithms work, first of all, it's a challenge. It's a challenge to actually do that because the algorithms involve machine learning and neural networks, and those are less explainable now than we would like them to be. That's a research problem. But let me set that aside for a moment. I'm going to go try the experiment with the 9/11. I thank you for drawing my attention to that. We might also try the same experiment with the coronavirus and find out how much comes up in the way of conspiracy theory versus helpful information. I did that this morning, and my impression, which might differ from yours, was that we put up more useful information than we did conspiracy theories about that. So I don't know what to say about 9/11, but I will go and do the test.
And I think 9/11 is a very important example of the challenge that's out there, that on both systems you're curating information which is populated from a very, very diverse foundation of understanding, of political starting point, and of course it's the most important information for our users to receive. And so on both the rater guidelines, which inform and share the intent behind the search algorithm and the quality in there, and very similar challenge on YouTube to make sure that whilst that content might not be illegal if you're searching for that, and it might not violate our community guidelines, actually we make sure that we do have the right rules in place around conspiracy theories which relate to harmful events, and we've changed the policy on that recently on YouTube to make sure that's reflected. And in terms of how you evaluate, I think that's a really important question. I think by sharing information like the rater guidelines, we hope to explain the intent behind our algorithms. But also, we are subject to academic research and scrutiny by many others. And there was a piece in the New York Times earlier this month which went deep on research undertaken by the University of California, where they had looked at 8 million recommendations from YouTube's Watch Next algorithm over 15 months. And actually, it's a really important piece of work because while it shows that the view time of conspiratorial recommendations had decreased by 50 and then 70%. There are also other challenges which were cyclical and different, and I think that shows that this isn't a easy solution for us to simply solve. It's a dynamic flow of A, the information that's being put on the internet, and B, us changing our policies, changing the way our tools work to make sure that we're reducing the availability of that content, but then actually people that create that content responding to the way that we change the rules. And so it's not something that will be solved on one day, but we hope and we do feel we see recommendations over time.
Lord Lipsey.
Improvements over time.
I just want to probe a bit this question of high quality and user-defined high quality, because it isn't unambiguous. I mean, high quality could mean more truthful. It could mean more people want to watch this particular piece of content for longer. A high-quality story in the British Daily Mail is not the same as a high-quality story in the Financial Times. And so I wonder how within the criteria that the panels are supposed to be looking at and feeding to the into the algorithm, I wonder how you distinguish those and how you make sure it's the really desirable quality that comes to the fore.
So I completely agree with your characterization of quality and source. If you, I don't necessarily urge you to read all 168 pages of the rating criteria for the web search, but they get to sources. They get to, remember, the people who are doing the evaluation are aware of quality sources, as you point out, like the Financial Times or some of the other New York Times and things of those publications or scientific publications are considered much higher quality than some of the popular press. That goes into their evaluations of web pages that they're looking at, and a similar kind of evaluation takes place in the YouTube case. But sticking with search for just a moment, since their evaluations take into account quality of source in the same way that you just did, then the training sets that they produce as a result reflect that recognition. So it's implicit in the training sets that have been generated and by the evaluation of the web pages that are used for training that we see a reflection of quality from source.
Katie, could I ask you a very specific question? Because this is about sensitivity, because not all information is equal. We would agree. You live in the UK, and you know that there are racial tensions in this country. Therefore, there are places you just don't go without unbelievable, I don't mean physically, without great care. Your algorithm took inaccurate information that Full Fact was quoting to us and presented at the top of its search results saying that Muslims do not pay council tax. Now that went straight to the top of your search results. It was also echoed by your voice assistant as well. That is catastrophic. I mean, a thing like that can set off a riot. So this is, and now obviously the 99% of what you do is not likely to do that. How sensitized are your algorithms to that type of error?
So actually, I'm glad you brought this up because it's an opportunity to say something about machine learning and neural networks. And I don't know about the specific incident that Katie might be.
It's unfair to cite one. It's just that it's an example.
Understood. But I do want to point out what I consider to be a continuing research area with neural networks. We know that they can be brittle. Has anyone been briefed on what's called generative adversarial networks? Does that ring a bell for anyone? You've probably seen, this might take about 3 minutes or so. Is it okay? Yeah. Well, so very quickly, machine learning systems have been used to do identification, for example, distinguishing cats, dogs, kangaroos, and so on, by training the neural network by telling it whether it got the answer right or not. And if it gets the wrong answer in response to an image, and you say that's the wrong answer, that back propagates into the network and weights are changed in order to get closer to the correct answer. So when you train these systems, they get to be really, really good at distinguishing pictures of animals and fire engines and things like that. Then you present them with something it's never seen before. And if it's successful, it will say it's a cat or a dog or what have you. But generative adversarial networks are also neural networks, and they're set up against the one that's supposed to correctly recognize things. And its job is to change a few pixels in the image to try to fool the recognition system, the classification system. There are cases where the change of just 2 or 3 pixels, which a human being would not recognize as a change, causes the system to say it's not a cat, it's a fire engine. And your reaction to this is, WTF? I mean, how could that possibly happen? And the answer is that these systems do not recognize things the same way we do. We abstract from images. We recognize cats as having little triangular ears and they're furry and they have a tail. And we're pretty sure that fire engines don't. But the mechanical system of recognition in the machine learning systems doesn't work the same way our brains do. So we know that they can be brittle, and you just cited a very good example of that kind of brittleness. We are working to try to remove those problems or identify where they could occur, but it's still an area of significant research. So your primary question is, are we conscious of the sensitivity and the potential failure modes? Yes. Do we know how to prevent all of those failure modes? No, not yet. But when they get reported, you can be sure there is a reaction, which is how do we adjust the system, or can we adjust the system to eliminate that particular brittleness?
Thank you very much indeed. Baroness Kidron.
Actually, before I ask the question, my designated question, I'd just like to ask you, when you describe the quality information that is the thing that then trains the system, you actually mentioned a whole series of things that were behind paywalls. And I just wonder whether it worries you personally that a lot of the very high quality material is currently behind paywalls, which means that there's a sort of a development of two directions of user in terms of access.
So that's actually a very good question, and I am not. I don't know. My first reaction, to be quite honest, is, well, why wouldn't we pay for getting access to that so we could index it? What do we actually do? Do you know?
So we work with news publishers that both don't use paywalls and do use paywalls. We've built particular tools to enable those who find a subscription model, the one that sort of supports their business the best. And we've changed the way that we index that content. So we used to set a requirement that you had to have a certain proportion that was available that wasn't behind a paywall, because we wanted the information to be openly available. But actually we've responded to publishers who are telling us, look, in this particular instance, the viable business model we've decided on is one that needs a subscription. So I think we have worked hard with those companies to make sure that we can index that information and reflect its importance, and then it's for the user to decide, okay, this is the content I want to discover, and therefore I'm going to subscribe or use it a different way.
I guess there are two pieces to this. One is we subscribe if we have to in order to do the training and the evaluation. However, that doesn't necessarily give that same information to the users unless they subscribe.
Yeah, okay. So I suppose in the spirit of due diligence, as you put it, how do you ensure that your algorithmic choices don't actually disadvantage certain sectors of the population? And I think, to be fair to you, I just want to point out that in your own evidence, or in Google's evidence, it talks about marginalised groups and the importance of those voices that may not have been represented, and it particularly points out young people in the LGBTQ plus community. And then actually there's a number of court cases going on at the moment from the same community saying, hang on a minute, we're considered less beneficial for advertising. And so there seems to be perhaps a value-driven issue around certain communities. So I just wonder how you consider those sensitivities in your algorithms.
So let me do two things, and Katie, I'm sure you'll have other things to say as well. First of all, we've gone to a fair amount of trouble to make sure that the LGBTIQ plus, I'm sure I got that right, community gets more positive more positive information is made available about that community than has historically been the case. So we go out of our way to try to make sure that there are positive stories about that community to reinforce the validity of those minority groups. With regard to monetization and advertising, two things are going on. First of all, we don't allow advertisers to use as criteria for advertising things like sex and gender and other skin color and all these other kinds of things. That's not a criterion that they can apply for purposes of advertising.
Just to clarify that slightly, we do allow advertisers on search to use gender of the user, but not sexuality of the user. Sorry, just for clarification.
Okay, sorry, thank you. So that helps a little bit. On the other hand, what that means is that the advertisers can't tell us not to show an ad, for example, on the basis of sex. So that's an attempt to defend against exactly the problem you're describing. Those court cases presumably will sort out to the extent to which we have been successful.
I'm just interested because all of the last few questions are really about, on the one hand, criteria, on the other hand, ranking of different varieties, and the fact that you actually, both positively in some of your examples and negatively in some of our examples, have an immense power as the mediator. And I'm just interested whether you're comfortable with your level of power in the mediation.
So if you're asking me personally, as opposed to corporately.
If there are two answers, please give both.
They're not the same. My biggest concern is for the users and their ability to think critically about what they see and hear. I think that the wetware up here is more important than anything that we could do, as hard as we try, and we will continue to try to give good quality information and reduce the visibility of poor quality information. But teaching people to think critically about what they see and hear. Where did this information come from? Is there any corroborating evidence for an assertion? These are the things that we should be teaching our children and practicing ourselves. And although I don't mean to suggest that that means we have no responsibilities, I am a huge fan of helping people learn how to do that. Because in the end, it's the person who has to decide what information to take on board and what to reject.
I think, yes, if I can add to your specific question, I think, these questions and our answers are a little bit, this is our intention, this is the work that we've done, and this is good examples and challenging examples. And I think that reflects the dynamic nature of all of this work. And I hope it reflects the efforts and the changes that we're making as a company to respond to what people expect from our services. And so I think the example you give, if you think of YouTube in its broadest sense, one of the reasons YouTube is so popular is because it allows diverse voices and communities to come together to create content, to share content, to really, form thriving communities in a way that has been really difficult in the past. And so if you're a teenager in a North Wales village, you can create a YouTube video and connect with people across the country who might be going through, other teenage issues similar to yours. And that absolutely we think is an additive and a positive thing. In recent years, we've also had challenges around, well, how are you allowing this kind of different kind of content on YouTube, which is being monetized and being supported by companies that don't understand what that content is, or that content shouldn't be monetized in the first place. And we've taken action to address that, to understand that yes, if you want to monetize on YouTube, you have to have a certain number of viewers and a certain number of subscribers, but you also have to be high quality. And sometimes there has been tension in the way that we've implemented that. And I think your question about the power that we have is a really important one, because we give everybody the right to appeal, and we also respond and listen very carefully to what our users are saying, make sure that the systems we're using are working in the way that we intended, which absolutely isn't to exclude some of our key communities. One of the things we've done, over the years that I've been talking to many of the members of this committee, or indeed talking at committees, we didn't have a transparency report for YouTube 3 years ago. We've introduced a transparency report for YouTube. We've included in that information on flags that we get from users, flags that we get from our machines, the categories of types of content that we've done that, the countries that are relevant, and we've just added to that information about appeals. So every user can appeal a decision that we make, and obviously that's really important if your channel is something that you're making, a revenue from. In some cases, it's the livelihood of the creator, and you can now, you've always been able to, but you can appeal all of those informations, and we're very serious in the way that we deal with those, but we also make that information public so that people can scrutinise whether there are a high number of appeals being upheld, or if we're not making those decisions in the way that would be expected. And I think, without getting into the particulars of the cases that are live, it's something that we understand very gravely, the responsibility of getting right and enabling these diverse communities who haven't been able to either find their community or make a living from that to continue to thrive on our platforms.
I really want to lock down on this question about corporate comfort, if you like, because, in one way we hear, and I hear exactly why you don't want to say what the criteria are so they're not gamed, yeah? Mm-hmm. But on another account, that does mean they're not transparent to us, the user. And is there not an argument, therefore, for a regulatory intermediary to say, actually, Google doesn't get to have all that power. We're going to share that power with a broader set of people, i.e. the regulators, the representatives of us. Yeah.
So just one thought immediately, and that is that the criteria on the search side and the criteria on the YouTube side are public,
yeah,
and available to the creators of web pages and YouTube. So at least you have that, and so you know our intent. Mm. And you can certainly decide whether or not we are achieving our intent or not, and that's what some of your questions are exactly about.
And I think just to add to that, there's really real granular detail around our monetisation policies and how advertisers can use the platform and choose which content they want to display against. And different advertisers will target different users depending on interests. And I think in terms of regulators, the government has obviously published its plans for the online harms white paper and has said it's minded to appoint Ofcom. I think that if, as those plans develop, Ofcom is exactly the right sort of organisation that can review the information it needs to understand what's in the public domain and what isn't in the public domain for it to be able to make credible and detailed understandings of those, because whilst we're making concerted efforts to put more and more information into the public domain so it can be scrutinised and tested, we understand that often people want an expert to do that too.
Thank you.
Short supplementary from Lord Lucas.
I don't want to trespass on question 3. If you're
can I go to
yes,
Lord
do
Holmes?
first. Thank you very much.
Great to have a tech legend in the house with us today. In what ways would Google search and YouTube experience be affected by increased algorithmic transparency? And what work have Google done in terms of allowing external audit of your algorithms and avoiding any negative impact?
Thank you very much for that question. Let me start out by observing that because our criteria for quality, for example, and other criteria for ranking purposes are public, that at least researchers know what our intent is, because that's clearly stated in the evaluation criteria and in the terms of service community standards that show up in the YouTube case. The second thing is that our properties are open in the sense that they can do experiments, so they can run any number of different queries that they want against either the World Wide Web search or the recommendations that come out of YouTube. So between those two, they could also construct neural networks, as we have, and compare whether or not their neural network structures work better than ours or comparably to ours. So we have given them enough information that they can perform experiments to determine whether or not our intent is being realized in the actual results that come back. And you mentioned the California UCLA study, I think, earlier that was related to that. So that's one way of getting there. Trying to describe what the algorithms are, from my point of view as a computer scientist, is actually rather difficult because of the introduction of the machine learning and neural network structure. I noticed that you were nodding when I was trying to explain that they do not explain themselves well at this point, and the brittleness shows up in somewhat unexpected ways. This is still an area for deep research. I'm very proud of the fact that one of our researchers, Jeff Hinton, was the recipient of the Alan Turing Award recently for his work in machine learning and artificial intelligence. So you can tell between that and DeepMind, and I'm sure you all are well aware of that group here in the UK, has garnered great visibility for its depth of understanding. We rely on them to help us move ahead.
I think if I can just add to that, we have seen examples where we've put information in the public domain, actually in Google's early days, where a paper was published around the importance of linking into our algorithm, where you actually quite quickly and very, very systematically saw websites exchanging links, paying for links, trying to game that system. And that only results in a detrimental outcome for our users, and it skews results, and it means that our results aren't as good as they are. So it's important, I think, that we explain our intent. It's important that we show our systems and when we make information public, but it is a real concern. I know it sounds like something that raises an eyebrow where we say, well, if we tell you too much, it will make the systems not work, but it is something that we have real evidence of in the past.
Mr. Chairman, it occurs to me that there is another analogy from the U.S. tax situation. The Internal Revenue Service has criteria for determining whether they are going to audit a return. There are a set of values and the thresholds and things like that. they keep that information tightly held so that people don't carefully craft their tax returns to avoid audit. There's a similarity, I think, to what we're concerned about. On the other hand, we're very much interested in improving the state of the art. And so we do fund research in universities on these various topics in order, and that information, by the way, is always made public. Those funded research things are not kept purely in-house. So we're part of the community that wants to make progress in this space, and we're happy to have the research community help us do that.
I think
identify helpfully the IRS example in that sense. What key differences would you see, though, in terms of what would be expected from a particular government agency and a private entity?
Oh, I'm not sure I understand the question, Lord Holmes. Could you say that again?
Certainly. So you correctly identify the IRS
Yes.
example as to why they wouldn't want to
Yes.
give up a lot of their ways and methodology. But on that, do you see that on that specific, there shouldn't be a different philosophical and actual approach from a private entity and a state entity?
I understand. First of all, we're back to the question of what can we share that is useful information to evaluate. And the most useful information that we can show, honestly, would be the training sets that are used for establishing the machine learning programs. I think the machine learning structure itself is fairly complex, and so it's not clear whether that's the best piece of information to share. I'm much happier having someone see what the criteria are and the training sets, and then perhaps come back with alternative machine learning mechanisms so that we could compare what the results are. That would be actually quite helpful.
We know you can tilt results. I mean, Jews used to have a number of unfortunate suggestions after it, no longer.
Yes.
You haven't adjusted Tories are, I notice.
Note to self.
Since we know you can bias results to deal with things in the real world, wouldn't it be a good idea if someone like Ofcom could have, under your supervision, total access to what's going on so they could reassure us that there was not some underlying bias being applied to the way Google is reporting politically sensitive information?
I think what's really important to understand here is the difference between the autocomplete and the results that you'll receive. And this is something that is fundamentally important to our engineers. Sometimes sitting where I sit in the public policy side of the building, you see the results that people type when they type something of clear intent, and the results are something that's very unsavoury and something that, you know, I wish somebody hadn't taken the time to create and to put on their blog post or elsewhere. But where we changed the autocomplete to make sure that it couldn't be used in offensive ways, as you described, that didn't mean that we necessarily changed the search results that came after that. So if you want to type something in around the Holocaust, using all of the criteria that Vint described earlier, making sure that we're returning expertise, authoritative and trusted results, we will give you meaningful and reliable information against that. But if you type something in that's very discriminatory or seeking hate-fueled content, you are still able to type that into Google search. And it's important to understand that because we are reflecting what is on the internet rather than curating the content we hope would be on the internet. And I think it's just important to have that clear understanding, because if it's viewed as you suggested that we bias results in one way or another, I think that can lead to some challenging misconceptions, which mean we're not dealing with the issue that we're hoping to deal with as society.
A number of people have given evidence, and I was particularly struck by Mozilla's evidence about exactly what data they would like to have access to in order to come, in order for research access to be meaningful, because we keep on hearing that actually the researchers aren't part of this conversation properly because, the companies are keeping data for commercial reasons to themselves. And I'm not sure that you can answer it right now, but I would be very interested to know what your view is of what the problem is of the access that they are asking for, the list of things that they suggested that should be in the public arena.
So I'd be interested to see what that list is.
Yeah.
I haven't seen the list. We should recognize that this is an extremely open space where there's lots of opportunity for trying new things out. No one is prevented from indexing the World Wide Web. We do it. Other people do it. Moreover, people are free in the research community to establish whatever neural network structures they want. We've given them all the criteria that we use for ranking. They could build their own training sets if they wanted to. I suppose, well, okay, we should come back to that.
I would be grateful if you would, perhaps in writing.
No, I think just to follow up on that, I think we are an organisation which in our mission is to make the world's information universally and usefully accessible, and within that is a commitment to open data. And so I think I did watch the evidence, but I don't remember the very specific requirements that they had, but we do make very powerful data sets that we use in our systems available, whether that's YouTube content, whether it's images, whether it's a natural questions database. We've also built a search engine specifically, built from Google Search, to help data scientists analyse all of the open data sets that are on the internet, and to make sure that there's an organised way of representing those. So I think, whether it's Android or Chrome, our browser as well, they are open source. So there are great opportunities for whether it's data scientists or other companies or academics to access that information. And it's not, exclusively content which is held by us.
So there's one other service that we offer at Google Cloud. There's a thing called What If. I don't know if you've bumped into that one, but it's intended to let people who are designing and building multi-layer neural networks to make small changes to figure out what happens. And so that's, in fact, the whole idea is exploring various alternative ways of...
Lord Chairman.
You told us you used two sets of human intervention. One was the human evaluators, who evaluate the people wanting to post, and the other one was, you said, we work with external experts. I wonder if you could give us some idea of the quantum of external experts, both in terms of size, but also paid and unpaid, supported, unsupported, and how much notice you take of them, and what methodology you have for understanding in what they're saying to you.
I have less information for you than I hope my colleague does, because this is not an area of expertise for me. I know that we have some 10,000 people engaged in trust and security, trust and safety, but I don't know how to split them up. So do you have better information than I do?
Yeah, so actually the 10,000 number refers to people within Google and YouTube working on the safety and security of our products, to make sure that where we have content on YouTube that people are trying to host that breaks our community guidelines, we're able to recognise it and take it down to help formulate those community guidelines. And that's one area where we would work very closely with external experts, and sometimes we would work with a very narrow number of external experts, perhaps just in one country where we have a particular issue, or it might be an issue where actually we want to understand the broad consensus of the community, and there might be different ways to do that. So to give you an example to bring that to life, on YouTube in the UK over the last couple of years, we've had an issue with drill music. So drill is a particular form of rap which is very aggressive, can seem very angry. It also gives young people an opportunity to reflect the communities that they've grown up in, and to have creative outlets. And so it's a real point of tension for a platform like YouTube, which wants to enable young people to have a voice to tell their story. But at the same time, some of this content had been linked very clearly, both by the police and by the courts in some instances, to real life examples of violence. So this was something we as a country team were very concerned about. We wanted to be a home for this music, but we didn't want to be a home for inciting violence. Now, if you or I were to upload a video onto YouTube and say, I'm going to go and see this person this evening and I'm going to beat them up, it would be very easy for us to determine the intent behind that, and that it wasn't an artistic expression, and it was something that didn't have a home on our platform. where does a rap song by one person, which is just kind of a telling of a story, versus a rap song of another, which includes a threat. We needed to understand how we distinguish between the two. And this wasn't expertise that we had in-house. We were able in-house to understand the parameters of the problem, the potential for impact on real life, the detriment if we were just to say, we'll take all dual music off. And so we were able to work with the Metropolitan Police, we were able to work with the Mayor's Office, we were able to work with the musicians themselves, with some of the people who host this content through channels on YouTube, by young community members and community members that have been victims of crime, and not just build up an understanding of the language and some of the slang in that content, but also understand where this was related to offline violence and where actually the content needed to come down, because it wasn't an artist expression or a telling of a story, but content that really shouldn't have a place on our platform. And so that's an example where, if we had one global policy for this music, it wasn't fit for purpose for this very specific instance in the UK, and we were able to work with experts to do that. We then replicate that in different ways on different issues. So around the world we have a system called Trusted Flaggers, where if you have particular knowledge of an issue, we will invite you to become a trusted flagger. So that might include, for example, in the UK, the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, who have deep knowledge about counter-terrorism issues. It might include a child safety organisation for their relative expertise. We will also have an intelligence desk which looks at issues which we haven't necessarily formulated policy about yet, but seem to be emerging threats or risks. And again, they will work with organisations around the globe. And then when we're looking at that content that we need to raise up on YouTube, that really authoritative, newsworthy content, perhaps from some of the broadcasters that we know to be trusted, that's where we might take specific members of a research community, so for example the medical profession, to determine what actually is the sensible view on this.
So, I'm sorry, it just occurs to me that we should all appreciate that this has to happen in about 100 different languages. And so we have a real problem, for example, with vocabularies of hate speech. We need to understand what those vocabularies are, and a lot of them are using code words that we wouldn't necessarily normally interpret in the way that is intended by someone who wants to incite violence or otherwise cause a problem. So I'm always astonished at the amount of language that we have to understand in some mechanical way in order to detect some of these problems.
Language, but you do new cultures and subcultures.
Yes, indeed. Same.
Very interesting. Lord Black.
Can I just take you back to an answer that you gave to Baroness Kidron's earlier question, when you were talking about the importance of teaching people to think critically about the information they're seeing, and you also talked about your role as a curator, in effect, of that information. But to what extent should one be able to go a step further than that and enable users to decide what content they see? In other words, should users be given more tools to restrict the pool of content that's shown to them, including the possibility of removing information from unverified sources?
So there are two things going on with that interesting question. One might be filtering and the other one might be blocking, and the question is, can the users do that on their own? They have the ability to change what it is that we think they're interested in. You know about that, and presumably you can go to your account and you can edit the things that we've tracked to the extent that they allow us to do that, in order to either alter the search response to provide things we think are of interest, or to decide which advertising they might be interested in. I don't think we've ever done anything along the lines that you're describing, although from time to time I've thought that if we had tools that would let people create this sort of filter for themselves, or maybe even for others, if other people wanted to subscribe to the Lord Black view of the World Wide Web, for example, maybe that would be of some interest to other people in addition to yourself. I don't believe we have tools that will let you do that, but it's an interesting notion. I'm not even sure what the practical implications would be, to be honest with you.
And I think
So, yeah, I'm not, I don't think I'm in a position to say, that's a great idea, we should go do it. But it's an interesting question. Could it be done? And could it be done at scale? And I don't think I know the answer to that yet.
Presumably the challenge to do it at scale.
Yes, exactly.
And
Exactly.
I think it's an interesting question if you think about it in terms of search and or YouTube. So in search, remember, you don't need to be logged in, you don't need to have a Google account. You can just arrive at the homepage and your intent is very clear in what you type into the search engine bar and what you're looking for. In YouTube, we do have the ability to create playlists around different themes where we are looking at recommendations that you can say you'd rather not have that recommendation in there. But again, a lot of it is driven by the intent of the user and what they're looking for rather than being served up.
Because I don't think you can answer it today, but if you could write to us, it would be very helpful. A lot of the questions that we're asking come down to research, quality of research, and what your relationship with this research community. Could you set out for us what your criteria are in deciding upon which research institutions and universities do and don't engage with you? Because it does slightly feel sometimes like cherry picking. And the idea that you're both judge and jury as to, yes, we'll work with them and we'd rather like that. But if I might say, this is what occurs to me. I happened to be looking recently at the Volkswagen scandal. And what was fascinating was, in the end, I think it was the University in Arizona that found there was a difference between on-road and off-road emissions from Volkswagen diesel cars. Now, had Volkswagen decided who to use to research their emissions, it might be a very, very different result. So I'm trying to get to a point, at what point does the government need to step in and take a very objective view? At what point are you prepared to, frankly, take a deep breath and say, whoever's got a great idea of how to improve this, we'll go with them? And to what extent do you have tighter criteria in terms of who you're prepared to license and give information to?
So let me try to respond first with our university relations activity, which I have had a connection with ever since I joined Google. This is, 15 years ago now. We publish areas of interest that we are looking for researchers to engage in. And we receive proposals from them, and we do an internal evaluation, peer review within the company for all the various proposals that come in, and then we basically fund the ones that were found to be the most interesting or most effective for our purposes. Again, I want to remind you that any research that we fund by that means is open research. It is published freely. We don't constrain any of that. So it's the criteria there have to do with how the engineers and the researchers at Google see the barriers to solving problems and finding people who have ideas that will get us further along. So that's not driven by corporate financial interests or anything. It's driven by basic research driver. Google is a data-driven company. It is maybe even over-the-top data-driven, because if you make an argument and you express an opinion and you don't have any data to back it up, your opinion doesn't count for very much. So the answer is that we really do choose to do research or to support research which advances the state of the art. It's a little bit like my years in the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, where you were confronted with a problem and the question was, how do I find the best people in the country to solve that problem? And we had the freedom to go find them. That's true at Google too.
But if you do have the time, Katie, if you could let us know, broadly speaking, what are the criteria and how frustrated could a research team from X university feel as not being able to ever penetrate your juice.
But I think that it's worth remembering that lots of research teams at different universities have been able to study our content, our algorithms and recommendations without permission from us, because they're just, are able to use various APIs to do that and various open information. And so I think there is absolutely academic partnerships that we have and the work that we do, which is relevant to us as a company. But there's also a whole ecosystem of people who do that research independently of us too.
So that's an implicit contract in the sense that all the information on the web is accessible to them. They can use our search engine. They can use our platforms. We offer free use of a lot of our research technology, like the TensorFlow, for example, for machine learning and the like. So there's a lot of enabling going on from Google to the research community, in addition to specific funded research.
Supplementary. Go ahead. Lord Mitchell.
Yes, thank you. I've been listening to this for nearly an hour now, and one of the feelings I get from the responses is, we're Google, you should trust us. And the point that the chairman said about judge and jury on these issues, and I must say, I feel uneasy about all of this. You have the resources, but in the end, these are your decisions which you make. And I just wonder if there's a sort of countervailing force that there should be to sort of level the playing field.
So there are countervailing forces, Lord Mitchell. One of them is called competition. And we do have competition. There are other search engines.
Oh, I must have missed that one.
So there is competition in the space. And that helps, I think, because people have the ability to go to other search engines if they want to. So they don't have to accept our results exclusively. They can even compare the results that you get from our search engines, from Microsoft search engines, and from others, even from experimental search engines.
But in this country, in search, or your country in search, what percentage of searches are on your platform? Google platform?
Probably in the 80% range, I would assume.
I've heard 90%. That doesn't sound like a very competitive situation to me.
I think that you should keep in mind that there is some choice involved. In other words, we don't force people to use our search engine. It's their decision to use the search engine, and it might be because they get better results from their point of view than from others. So to be fair, Google is not forcing anyone to use their search engines, if that's the implication that you intended. A different question might be whether the choice of using Google is in the interest of the users. And in a way, you have to give some credibility to the user's ability to make that determination. They can go elsewhere if they want to. I sense that isn't satisfying you, so can we probe a little deeper about what is it that you are, what's making you uncomfortable?
What's making me uncomfortable is what I would feel is a sort of monopolistic position over the product. Mm-hmm. You tell me you have competition, but I don't see that competition, and it is you who take a lot of the decisions to do with content, and it just feels that you have all the aces in this situation, and I'd like to feel that there were moderating forces.
So this might be worth doing some additional research, because the other competitors have comparable platforms with comparable capacity to index and to search the World Wide Web. So the fact that we have a lot more users, perhaps, is not the same as having no competitors. It's the choice of the users that has spoken, I think.
Baroness McGregor-Smith.
Could you maybe explain to us what the role of human moderation is in improving online experiences? I'm really interested in knowing how could you make the processes more transparent and a little bit more consistent, and have you considered the idea of having a public database which explains how you have moderated, and also explaining a system of precedences to the public to ensure that everyone can understand how you have greater equity and fairness in your decision making?
So that's a nice portmanteau question with many parts.
Yes.
And we touched on some of them already. We have a publication that's coming out in April, the title of which is, this is one that's describing how we handle YouTube as well as handling. So we've got this big 168-page criteria for evaluators, which is very public. We don't have, and we have the terms and services for YouTube, but we have additional information about YouTube coming out in April, which again is the public, intended to be released to the public, so that responds in part to your question about public access to how things work. In terms of moderation and content evaluation, I would be repeating myself if I go back to say what we said before about the technique by which we transform the criteria into a machine learning model, which is then applied for scaling up of the evaluation of content on search, and similar mechanisms for the case of YouTube and its recommendations.
But there will be human intervention
yes,
at the beginning, and my question is, how do you explain to say me what that, how does a human make those decisions? And what could because before it gets into the algorithms, etc., there is human intervention.
Exactly, and that's why this...
I know you have your 168 pages.
Right, which I'm happy to give you.
But it's also about the real simplicity of how could you explain, say on YouTube, very simply, about how you moderate. Where could I click, very simply, that says, this is how we've moderated on this particular case?
This particular case.
Indeed, yeah. So I'm talking about, look, these are the ones you've moderated on and why you've made the decisions you've made in very maybe simple non-IT language.
We have, whenever we change our community guidelines, we make sure that it's very clear for the creator community, because if you break our community guidelines, we will often impose a sanction. We don't want to do that if people have made an innocent mistake. So our community guidelines are set out in detail in plain English. We also use video to represent what they are, and we also give examples of content that may or may not be within the allowance. If you flag a video, we now have you are able to look at the dashboard to see what's happened to that flagged video, and if you are the host of that video, if that content is yours, you will be able to see why we have taken that content down. So if, for example, we took a piece of content that you had on your channel down because of a copyright violation, we'll let you know the detail of that. And if you've made a 10-minute video and just within 1 minute there happens to be a song on the radio and that's been spotted by our copyright mechanisms, we will explain that to you, and you're able to repost the video editing out that bit of copyrighted material. We also make sure that in the transparency report I talked about, that we also include that information about adjudicators in there, and we also have content which explains what happens when people flag a content and flag content, who reviews it and how is it reviewed.
How do you ensure that you have consistency across your decision making?
So we have very clear guidelines. So most of our review is done by machine learning. So that's where, as Vince described, we will use humans to set the community guidelines of what we do and don't allow. And then we'll use machine learning to identify that content. And so about 70% of the content that's flagged on YouTube is now flagged by that machine learning and is able to be removed without, I think it's about 60% is able to be removed without a single view. So it's 90%.
You mean a single view by a human?
By a human, yes. So sorry, about 90% of the content we remove on YouTube is detected by a machine, and about 65%.
Can I just mention one other thing? Consistency is very important. I'm glad you brought that up. In the case of search, for example, we don't take just one reviewer's opinion about things and apply it. So we get at least 9 different reviews of a web page before we would try to aggregate what the rating was for the quality of that web page. So again, we're trying very hard. But I like the point that Katie makes, that consistency is imposed by the fact that it's automated for the bulk of the content.
But if there is content that requires a human review, then a human will look at that using our community guidelines, detailed guidance that they have. And there's processes, again, to have a second opinion, to consolidate on something. And, in very particular cases, it will require not just a reviewer, but judgment from other colleagues around.
And would you be prepared to publish how they made the decision?
So when we remove content from a channel, we will share with the channel host why that content has been removed. It's sometimes, I think we have made, I'm trying to remember the example, which I'm afraid I can't remember and happy to update you on, where we have made detailed cases available to use as a tool to teach our community members who upload that content exactly how we do that. What we do in our transparency report is take, the million videos that we might remove in a quarter and explain what type of content they were, why the content was removed, and explain the granularity in that. In certain cases, perhaps very high profile or contentious content which is removed, we will communicate that as we do with every single content creator, and then they may choose to share or make it clear. But is there, what are you...
I guess I'm interested, if I'm a member of the public and I'm trying to understand how you moderate and content is taken down, the human intervention will be following a process. This question is, how can you be so... how do you know that human intervention is sensible? Because, human beings all do things differently.
Yeah.
And how can you help, therefore, over a period of time, the public understand that the way that humans are moderating is the right way, as opposed to ad hoc, and as opposed to non-tick box. Here's 10 things we have to think about.
But that's partly what the transparency report is intended to do, to give people a statistical understanding of what types of content have been removed and for what reason. So that data that's new.
Yes, no, I'm
That's something.
and I think go deeper
but I
on
think
each one.
That should be read with the community guidelines, which really clearly sets out what content is and isn't allowed. And that would be, if you were creating content on YouTube or a member of the public, your first understanding of, okay, we don't allow pornography, we don't allow content which incites hate, we don't allow content which seeks to discriminate on the grounds of race. That sort of information, and that's there. And then we have training, management of, obviously machines do automate a lot of it, and then the human reviewers, we have, as in any walk of life, systems in place to train, to manage, to review, to quality control check, and all of those things. And, humans will make different decisions on different days for different reasons, but we have the processes in place to eliminate and to minimise that criteria, just as any other organisation which is trying to make routine decisions will have.
I have a personal experience with our YouTube system. I was here, as some of you may know, to receive the Queen Elizabeth Prize for Engineering in 2013. And we were asked collectively if we would meet with school children, and so we did for several hours, and there was a video made of this. And after the video was produced, I was asked, could I arrange to have it put up on YouTube? So I did. It was about a 90-minute video, and about 2 minutes after I put it up on YouTube, I got a note saying, your video has been taken down for a copyright violation by the International Olympics Committee. And so it turned out that our fingerprinting mechanism for identifying videos that have been registered as copyright picked up a 15-second segment of some bicycle riders who were operating at an angle, and the person who was making the presentation to the students used it to explain, how gravity works and how you don't fall over on your bicycle even when you're at a funny angle. And so I was allowed to lodge an appeal. And within not very many hours, my video got back up again. But I was very impressed with how quickly the fingerprinting system worked. So plainly, we've done at least something that works pretty effectively.
Thank you.
Clearly, what the common denominator of every session we've had, one way or another, is the building of trust. I think we totally agree with that. That's where we're in the trust building business in a sector which has got big question marks over it constantly, rightly or wrongly. That being the case, things like, what would be your resistance to having your moderators? televised, and I know there's a lot of stuff around the Channel 4 programme, but literally talking about the way they see the world, the kind of decisions they have to make. That's how you build trust, is by having people on the ground fairly consistently and openly talking about how difficult their job is. You don't build trust by, in a sense, creating a wall around those people and saying they mustn't talk to the public.
And I think I was struck by some of the other evidence, I think, made by several witnesses who've talked at previous commissions, who say, you know, this isn't a punitive process to punish technology companies. This is actually something that's, and talk about the online harms process, which can be beneficial for companies. And actually, we very much agree. So we know, you know, many of us have been having conversations around the UK government's response here for many years, and actually we have a clear set of intent from the UK government, but we haven't had legislation in the past few years. And so as a company, we haven't waited for that legislation. We have listened very carefully to what people are saying to us, sometimes constructively, sometimes very critically, and responded to that in what we feel is the best way possible. I don't think anybody who works at Google or YouTube thinks, job done, you know, turn the page. This is absolutely a series of incremental steps which start with us making sure we have the right policies in place, we're able to build the right technology, employ the right people, communicate in the right way, be scrutinised in the right way, and keep that trust of our users. Because to refer to that earlier conversation, you know, it's very, very easy to move from one search engine to the other. If you're not getting trusted information, if you're not seeing information that you believe in on YouTube, you're not going to use that. And so we need to make sure that people continue to get a good service through our platforms, but also understand that with the, you know, really important third-party input, whether that's from a regulator, from government, from systems like this, we are able to share our workings. And I think the improvements that we've made to the transparency process, which are, again is not settled, will help achieve that.
You know, I would say that transparency is our friend here. I take your point. There's no question in my mind about that. The kind of transparency and how deep it goes is somewhat an open question. But I sense, I want to come back to something that Lord Mitchell raised, because I now understand another potential concern that might be motivating your comments. If, in fact, people choose to use Google in lieu of anything else, I think some of you are looking for assurance that if they use Google, they're getting the best quality information that could reasonably be provided to them. Am I getting the message?
I think that's not a bad way of typifying. I think that the only word I'd use is we are hoping that Google will reach up to a standard that all of us can sign off on and stop having this rather weird series of unfortunate questions. Around this table, we're believers in the digital world, definitely. There's no skeptics here. What we want is a better digital world and a trusted digital world.
So do I.
I figured. Lord Lucas, I think you may have actually almost answered the question, but not.
Yes. I mean, the work you're doing on borderline content in YouTube really raises the same questions again. You were talking about hate speech and racism. Well, you'll see in the newspaper today that Trevor Phillips is in the middle of a controversy in that I would hate the idea that some group of woke Californians were dictating what I could see in YouTube content because I have although it's that somebody else should be defining the borders there. Why not be open? Why not let us share in understanding how this is working? I mean, we'd all love to see goop less. But
gosh, the community guidelines are available to you. I don't know whether you've seen them, but those are the ones that...
But it's not the guidelines, it's what happens in practice.
So, what you see in practice is the consequence of applying the guidelines through a group of people who...
It's a consequence of you applying the guidelines.
Yes.
It's not a process that is visible to us.
Well, the results...
The chairman says, how do we build trust in that? I mean, there are mechanisms for it, perhaps by having a regulator with oversight who can look at these things if you're not wanting to let information out, but trust is important.
So I would take away from that question a challenge to Google, which is to figure out how much more transparent we can be in order to be helpful to respond to your concern. It is the case, however, that you can see the results of what we do. And you could compare the results of what we do with what other people do. So there's the possibility, in fact, this might be a perfectly reasonable research thing.
So I can see, there is some way in which I can see the results on a YouTube search that you are downplaying. I can ask you to show me all the videos that you're not showing me.
I don't think that we can show you what we're not showing you. I think that's a very interesting way of formulating it. Everyone who isn't here, raise your hand. So I don't think we have the ability to do that. But you could see the differences in different search engine responses to compare.
And I think that different organisations will look at different search engines or video hosting websites with particular reference to their area of specialism. So the Internet Watch Foundation, for example, looks at different open and social media platforms in terms of the child abuse material that they either identify themselves or are flagged to them, and they publish that data in their annual report. And we absolutely publish the guidelines that we use in our community guidelines, and then the implementation of those in the transparency reports. And then that is available to be compared on the open system, which is, the research that I cited at the beginning, done by the University of California. My understanding is that wasn't done in conjunction with us. That was done, by using YouTube APIs to understand what content was on there, and then what content was being used in our recommendation. And I think you can go on, as an enthused amateur to look at the content that we return when we do search results on YouTube, the content which we may be recommended, which will have a number of thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of views. And then you might look, if you're looking for a particular type of niche content, you might see that content on there, but you might see it's been on for a month and it's had 200 views. And that will be because we are trying to raise up authoritative content, which is either established in the scientific community or created by a very trusted news provider, and where the community guidelines or the law doesn't prohibit us having the other content on, it's okay to be there, but we are not raising it up or rewarding it.
I think,
and you don't think that this is a proper role for government rather than a private company?
I think the government have made it very, very clear that they do want to bring regulation forward in this space. That Ofcom is their suggested regulator, and we will work very, very closely with them. We've said that we welcome regulation where it can be constructive and where it will help our users and people who are concerned about how the internet impacts our everyday lives understand those issues more, and that absolutely is the case in the UK.
Could I just explore something with Lord Lucas for a moment? Because I don't know exactly the model you have in your head about the mechanics of what's actually going on. Mm-hmm. But the pieces, which we've talked about several times now, I'm sure you're tired of that, but is the criteria are there, and we have training sets against which we place the criteria. Humans do that. But the net result is this neural network structure, which is a bunch of numbers, basically. It's a complex interconnection of weights that take input in and pop out with something in the bottom to tell us, what quality this particular web page is. I'm not sure that showing you the neural network would be helpful. It's not like a recipe that you would normally think of when you write a computer program. It's not an if-then-else kind of structure. It's a much more complex mathematical structure. And so that particular manifestation of the decision-making may not be particularly helpful to look at. So the real question is, what else would be useful in order to establish the trust that we've been talking about and the utility of that trust. So I'm still struggling to know what would be really helpful for you or Ofcom to see in order to evaluate how well or how poorly we are doing in terms of quality.
I would see it, I have a similar mechanism up here, and it develops a lot of inherent biases. And I want to see Ofcom looking at the end results that you're producing and at the raw material, in other words, all of what's available on YouTube and what actually gets shown in research content, and saying, are we seeing biases in here? Are we seeing something, people being directed in a particular direction because of the way in which the system is built and trained, without wanting to know the details of that, just saying, is the end result something we're happy with? Should we trust the process?
So I think we need to inject into this conversation once again the scale issue, because if you notice when you do a Google search, it comes back and says, I found 10 million hits in 30 milliseconds. And some people say, why don't you show all of them on the first page? And we say we don't have any fonts small enough to put them all up. So scaling is a problem here. You can't show all 10 million of those hits in any way other than some serial process. And it may be hard for anyone to analyze all 10 million or whatever it is in order to answer your question. Show me all the stuff that you didn't show me. Show me everything that wasn't in the first 10 pages. You have the ability, if you want to look at the, you can force the system to keep going. And to see what it is that we turned up that we considered not worthy of your attention. So there is a way to do that, but to do all of it, to hand you all 10 million pages, I don't know if that would be helpful.
Good news is you're both incredibly popular of streaming at the moment. The bad news is your officers are very anxious to get you away at around 2 o'clock. So could I just jump to the final question from Lord Jermyn, because it is utterly central to our purposes as a committee, and maybe write to you on the other two that we will have unfortunately not got to.
My question is about digital advertising, and you, as Google, chose restrictions in November 2019. Have you monitored the effect of the restrictions on political advertising that you've made, and what conclusions have you reached?
So I don't have an answer for that. Do you?
Yes, I do.
Good.
Thank you.
I'm just the engineer in this.
You're right that we allow political advertising on Google, but with restrictions, and those are restrictions that we determined both on a global basis and also ones that respect local law. So when we've enabled political advertising historically in the US, it's been different to the UK, and obviously UK and US political systems have lots of similarities, but in terms of funding and the way political campaigns are run, that's very different. So we do allow political advertising, but we allow it with a register so we can enable transparency. The first thing we want to do, regardless of advertising or not, is make sure that people have trusted information about political elections. It's super important if you're looking for a candidate or you're looking for a manifesto policy, you have information, and we find it to be most trusted when it's from the source and we can display that information. We also want to make sure that there are secure elections, and in the UK that's perhaps not as front of mind as it is in some other countries, but we work with candidates and political parties to ensure where they need support that their sites and their emails can't be compromised by technology attacks. And then we work sure to make sure where we have allowed political advertising that there's full transparency. So the criteria that we have set is that if you want to run a political advert, that's something that we say includes a political party, an elected office holder or a candidate for the UK Parliament elections, then you need to be registered with us. We will verify that information and then allow you to run a political advert. Obviously the advert has to comply with the law, the spending has to comply with the legal limits here, but we make that information publicly available. So if any of the political parties want to run an advert, we will say we provide information on who that advert is looking to reach, how many people saw that advert and the cost of that advert, and we collect this data and publish it in our digital ads library, and we make sure it's there with a copy of the ad that you can see, but also it's available as an API or in rich data form so that you can conduct analysis of it.
In your definition, you've only allowed adverts to be targeted about age, gender and postcode, and you did exactly the same thing in the States and got criticised by the Democrats and the Republicans for not engaging in free speech and not allowing the parties to... How would you respond to the Democrats, the Republicans and to the political parties in this country?
That's my turn.
Okay.
That's my territory.
Well, I was about to say actually that I am definitely not a specialist on US elections, and I think we look to get the balance right. So, and the US restrictions were slightly different to the UK elections prior to the general election, but we don't allow advertising on sensitive topics anyway, and we feel that it's useful for people to understand particularly the location, but micro-targeting isn't something that we use on our platform more generally, and we felt this was getting the balance right. I think different parties choose to campaign in different ways, and obviously they seek systems that will be most effective for themselves.
Well, could I just pose that question at the South Bend question? If you wanted to take a particular avenue in South Bend, would you be able to do that? Or would you be able to take all the people in South Bend who had views about a particular issue which was current in the political spectrum in the United States?
I don't think that criterion is allowed in our advertising system. I don't think that we're that refined, particularly in the political space. So as you said, we have only a small number of criteria that are permitted for targeting with political ads.
Your definition is different from the ones used by Facebook, for example. Do you think we ought to have a common definition? If so, who should make that definition and how should it be approached? And what's your complaint about Facebook?
I don't think I have a specific complaint about Facebook that I could, surface. Other than my personal reactions to some of the things that are on Facebook. I think your idea, though, that there might be common criteria for political advertising, I think has a certain merit to it, because then we would see consistency of treatment, and that's important because there are so many different platforms available for purposes of political, let me use the word, not just advertising, but political speech. And in the U.S., we've already experienced the serious side effects of the abuse of some of these platforms and the ability to target specific audiences for purposes of inciting disagreement. I don't know whether you've experienced similar things here in the UK, but they've been well documented in the United States, and I think our platforms should not be... We should make it difficult for our platforms to be abused in that way.
You've been very, very patient with us, and I apologise for the fact that we've overrun. Just one interesting thing. You started life in the defence industry, and we're dealing with this controversial the issue at the moment. Do you feel, on balance, that technology is making it more likely that we'll reach a satisfactory situation or less than it would have been? And I'm particularly thinking about the amount of misinformation and disinformation that's already emerging on platforms. Is that something that is very troubling to you, or something you feel on balance with the right side of the...
I use our tools every single day. I don't think I would survive without having the ability to search through the World Wide Web and get information, get answers. I exercise critical thinking as much as I can about sources and content. I am a very optimistic person with regard to the value of what's been done so far. I am very concerned about the abuse of the system and looking for ways to counter that. And those ways may be mechanical, but they also involve the wetware up here. And so my position is this is all positive stuff, but we need to deal with how do we preserve the value while we defend against the abuse. Some of the abuse is motivated by the same thing that causes us to read Shakespeare 400 years later, because people haven't changed a bit, and he lays out all of the good and the bad and the ugly. But we're human beings, and we should try very hard to make our tools serve us and our society in a positive way.
That's a lovely ending. Thank you very, very much indeed. Sorry, it was nearly lovely.
So could I just correct? I asserted that if you Googled 9/11, you'd end up with all sorts of conspiracy theories. I've just done it, and discovered that in fact your algorithms now put them so far down I got bored looking for them. Now, if you do Google Twin Towers, you end up quite quickly with a news article from the Sun newspaper, which starts off a wacky conspiracy theory, but then actually just sets out the conspiracy theory without a rebuttal. But all I'm saying is clearly things have got better, and I apologise.
No, you should not apologize. Lord Harris, you have demonstrated exactly the scientific method, and for this you should be congratulated.
And the value of inquiries. Thank you.
Thank you very much.